The history of the plague mask, a journey through medicine, fear, and symbolism. Welcome. Settle into a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and prepare to journey through one of history's most haunting and misunderstood objects, the plague doctor's mask. Tonight, we'll explore the strange bird-like mask that has become an icon of medieval medicine, a symbol of death and disease, and a fixture in our collective imagination. This is a story that spans centuries, from the devastating pandemics that swept through Europe to modern horror films and Halloween costumes. It's a tale of desperate measures, misguided theories, surprising compassion, and the peculiar ways that protective equipment becomes mythology. Don't worry about remembering every detail. Let the words wash over you like a gentle tide. If you drift away before our story ends, that's perfectly fine. That's exactly what we're here for. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin in the darkness of the 14th century, when death arrived on ships from the east. The Black Death arrives. In October of 1347, 12 ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. They had come from the Black Sea, carrying goods, sailors, and something far more sinister. Most of the sailors aboard were dead. Those who still lived were gravely ill, covered in mysterious black boils that oozed blood and pus. The harbor masters ordered the ships away immediately, but it was already too late. The disease that would come to be called the Black Death, or simply the plague, had arrived in Europe. It would kill between 75 and 200 million people over the next 7 years, wiping out somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. To put that in perspective, imagine if tomorrow 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you knew was dead within a few years. Entire villages were emptied. Cities lost half their inhabitants. The world as people knew it was ending. The plague moved with terrifying speed. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. The symptoms were horrifying: painful swellings in the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings, called buboes, gave the disease its medical name, bubonic plague. They would grow to the size of apples, turn black, and often burst. Victims suffered from fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and terrible pain. Many developed dark patches on their skin as blood vessels ruptured beneath the surface, hence the name Black Death. No one understood what was happening. Medieval medicine was based largely on ancient Greek and Roman theories, particularly the work of Galen, a physician from the 2nd century. According to these theories, disease was caused by imbalances in the body's 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness resulted when these humors became imbalanced, often due to bad air, or miasma. The plague seemed to confirm the miasma theory. It appeared to spread through the air, moving from person to person, from house to house, from city to city. People noticed that those who cared for the sick often became sick themselves. They observed that the disease seemed worse in crowded, dirty areas. They saw that certain smells and conditions seemed associated with the plague's presence. But they were wrong about the mechanism. The plague was not spread by bad air. It was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on rats. When an infected flea bit a human, the bacteria entered the bloodstream and began to multiply. But this understanding wouldn't come until the late 19th century, more than 500 years after the Black Death ravaged Europe. Medieval medicine's response. In the face of this unprecedented catastrophe, medieval physicians tried everything they could think of. They bled patients, believing this would rebalance the humors. They applied leeches. They prescribed herbal remedies, many of which had been used for centuries to treat various ailments. They recommended special diets. They prayed. Nothing worked. Many physicians fled the cities when the plague arrived, unwilling to risk their own lives treating a disease they couldn't cure and barely understood. This abandonment left cities desperate for medical care. Town councils and wealthy citizens began hiring physicians specifically to treat plague victims, offering high salaries to compensate for the extreme risk. These physicians became known as plague doctors. The plague doctors who stayed or were hired faced an impossible task. They knew they were likely to contract the disease themselves. Mortality rates among physicians who treated plague patients were extraordinarily high. Yet they continued their work, driven by duty, by financial necessity, or by a combination of both. These early plague doctors, during the initial waves of the Black Death in the 14th century, wore no special protective equipment. They used the same clothing and tools they would for treating any other disease. Many died as a result. The lesson was clear: proximity to plague victims was deadly. But the understanding of why remained elusive. The miasma theory suggested that if bad air caused disease, then protecting oneself from that bad air might prevent infection. Physicians began experimenting with strong-smelling substances, believing that powerful scents could overcome or neutralize the bad air. They carried bunches of herbs, held pomanders filled with aromatic substances, and burned incense in sick rooms. Some physicians began to develop more elaborate protective measures. They wore long robes that covered their bodies completely. They used gloves. They carried wooden canes or sticks that allowed them to examine patients without touching them directly. These measures helped somewhat, though the physicians of the time couldn't know exactly why. They were accidentally creating barriers between themselves and the infected fleas that actually transmitted the disease. But the most distinctive and elaborate form of plague doctor protective equipment wouldn't emerge until much later, during subsequent outbreaks of plague in the 16th and 17th centuries. This is when the iconic bird-like mask would make its appearance, born from the continued belief in miasma and a desperate desire to protect those who treated the dying. The plague returns. The Black Death of the 14th century was devastating, but it wasn't the last time plague would sweep through Europe. The disease became endemic, returning in waves every few years or decades. Major outbreaks occurred throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Each outbreak brought death tolls in the thousands or tens of thousands. Cities that had rebuilt after previous plague years would be devastated again. These recurring epidemics kept the fear of plague alive in European consciousness for centuries. Every generation lived with the knowledge that the plague could return at any time. When summer came and the weather warmed, people watched anxiously for signs of disease. A fever, a swelling, a sudden death, any of these could signal the beginning of another outbreak. By the 16th century, plague had become a regular feature of European life. Cities developed elaborate public health measures to try to control outbreaks. They established quarantine procedures, isolating sick individuals and sometimes entire households. They created plague hospitals, separate from regular hospitals, where victims could be taken to die away from the healthy population. They hired officials to monitor the dead, count the bodies, and track the disease's spread. It was in this context of recurring plague, of cities that had learned to live with periodic catastrophe, that the distinctive plague doctor's costume emerged. Physicians and public health officials had had time to think about protection, to experiment with different approaches, to develop theories about what might keep the doctors alive while they treated the dying. The costume that would emerge was strange, frightening, and based on the best medical understanding of the time. It was also, in its own way, a masterpiece of practical design, even if the theory behind it was fundamentally flawed. The bird-like mask, the long robe, the leather gloves, the wooden cane, each element served a purpose, reflected a belief about how disease spread and how it might be prevented. As we move forward in our story, we'll explore how this costume came to be, who designed it, what each piece was meant to do, and how the plague doctor became one of history's most enduring and unsettling images. But for now, rest easy, knowing that we're just beginning this strange journey through medicine, mortality, and the masks people wore to face death. The birth of the costume. The year was 1619, and plague had returned to Paris. The disease had never truly left Europe, but it moved in cycles, striking different regions at different times. When it came to a major city like Paris, the death toll could be staggering. The city needed physicians willing to treat plague victims, and it needed to keep those physicians alive long enough to be useful. Enter Charles Delorme, chief physician to King Louis XIII of France. Delorme was a man of considerable learning and practical experience. He had studied medicine in Montpellier, one of Europe's finest medical schools, and had served in the courts of several European monarchs. He had seen plague outbreaks before and understood the terrible toll they took on the physicians who treated victims. Delorme set himself a challenge to design a costume that would protect physicians from the miasmatic air believed to carry the plague. He drew on existing practices, the long robes, the gloves, the avoidance of direct contact, but he wanted something more comprehensive, something that would create a complete barrier between the physician and the poisoned air of the sickroom. The result was a costume unlike anything that had been seen before. It covered the physician from head to toe, leaving no skin exposed to the air. But the most striking element, the piece that would capture imaginations for centuries to come, was the mask. And it wasn't just any mask. It was shaped like a bird's beak, long and curved, protruding from the face in a way that was both practical and deeply unsettling. The beak wasn't merely decorative or symbolic. It served a specific purpose within the framework of miasma theory. The long, hollow beak was designed to hold aromatic substances, a mixture of herbs, spices, and other strong-smelling materials. These included ingredients like mint, camphor, rose petals, cloves, laudanum, myrrh, and storax. The physician would breathe through the beak, and the air would pass through these aromatics before reaching his nose and mouth. The theory was that these strong, pleasant smells would purify the air, overcoming or neutralizing the miasma that carried disease. If bad air caused plague, then good air, or at least powerfully scented air, might prevent it. The longer the beak, the more aromatics could be packed inside, and the more thoroughly the air could be filtered and purified. Delorme's costume was adopted, with variations, by plague doctors across Europe. It became standard equipment for those brave or desperate enough to treat plague victims. The costume made the doctors look strange and frightening, but that was acceptable. What mattered was whether it kept them alive. Anatomy of the costume. Let's examine each element of the plague doctor's costume more closely, understanding what each piece was meant to do and what it reveals about 17th century medical thinking. The mask itself was typically made of leather, shaped and hardened into the distinctive beak form. Glass openings were set into the mask at eye level, allowing the physician to see while protecting the eyes from direct contact with the air. The glass also created a physical barrier, preventing droplets or other materials from reaching the physician's face. Some masks included red glass lenses. This choice wasn't arbitrary. The color red was associated with blood, one of the four humors, and was thought to have protective or balancing properties. The red-tinted view of the world might also have served a psychological purpose, making the horrific sights in plague wards slightly less immediate and disturbing. The beak was attached to a leather cap that covered the entire head, leaving only the glass eye openings exposed. This cap extended down to meet the collar of the robe, creating a seal so that no skin was left vulnerable to the supposedly contaminated air. The robe itself was made of waxed or oiled leather or heavy canvas, treated to make it somewhat waterproof or at least resistant to fluids. It extended from the neck to the ankles, covering the entire body. The treated leather was thought to prevent the miasma from penetrating to the physician's skin. The dark color, usually black or dark brown, was practical. It wouldn't show stains, but it also contributed to the ominous appearance of the plague doctor. Leather gloves covered the hands completely, tucked under the sleeves of the robe. These served an obvious protective function, preventing direct skin contact with patients or contaminated materials. The gloves extended well up the forearm, ensuring no gap existed between sleeve and glove where skin might be exposed. Boots, also of leather, covered the feet and lower legs. Like the gloves, they tucked under the robe, creating an overlapping barrier. The physician stood, literally from head to toe, encased in treated leather and cloth, breathing filtered air through a beak full of aromatics. The costume included one more essential element, a wooden cane or stick. This served multiple purposes. The physician could use it to examine patients without touching them directly, pointing to areas of swelling or concern, lifting blankets, or directing patients to move in certain ways. The cane could also be used to take a patient's pulse without the physician's fingers touching the patient's skin. Some physicians used the cane for a more somber purpose, to keep desperate, dying plague victims from grabbing at them. In the delirium of fever and the terror of imminent death, patients sometimes tried to clutch at their doctors, seeking comfort or begging for help. The wooden cane maintained the crucial distance between physician and patient. The experience of wearing the costume. Imagine, for a moment, what it was like to wear this costume. You're a physician in 17th century Europe. Plague has come to your city, and you've been hired, for a substantial fee, because the risk is so great, to treat the sick and dying. You begin by putting on the undergarments and the long robe, pulling it tight around your body. The leather is heavy, stiff, and it smells of the wax or oil used to treat it. Then comes the mask. You lift it over your head, settling the leather cap down so it covers your hair and the back of your neck. The fit is snug, perhaps uncomfortable. You adjust it until the glass eye openings align properly with your eyes. The world immediately becomes strange. Your field of vision is limited by the eye openings. Your peripheral vision is largely gone. You can see only what's directly in front of you, visible through two circles of glass. If the glass is tinted red, everything takes on a bloody hue, dreamlike and disturbing. Your breathing is suddenly loud in your own ears, the sound echoing inside the leather beak that now projects from your face. Each breath draws air through the tightly packed aromatics, mint, cloves, camphor, rose petals. The smell is overwhelming, almost choking. Your eyes might water from the intensity of it. But this, you've been told, is what will protect you. This concentrated wall of scent is all that stands between you and the poisonous miasma that has killed thousands. The beak is long enough that you can see it in your lower field of vision, a constant reminder of the barrier you've placed between yourself and the world. When you turn your head, the beak turns with you, preceding you into each room like the prow of a ship cutting through dangerous waters. You pull on the leather gloves, feeling the stiffness of the material, the way it limits the dexterity of your fingers. You pick up your wooden cane, feeling its weight, its solidity. This cane is your tool and your shield, allowing you to maintain distance from those you're meant to help. Now you're ready. You walk through the streets of the city toward the plague house, toward the suffering and dying. People see you coming and shrink back. Children cry at the sight of you. You've become something not quite human, a walking embodiment of the disease itself, a dark bird of death stalking through the streets. Your footsteps echo. Your breathing is loud and steady inside the mask, in and out through the scented beak. The leather creaks as you move. You are strange and frightening, but you are also necessary. Someone must tend to the sick. Someone must count the dead. Someone must try, however futilely, to fight back against the plague. The reality of plague doctors' work. The plague doctors' work was grim and usually futile. They entered homes where entire families lay dying or dead. The smell, even through the aromatics packed into their beaks, must have been overwhelming. Plague victims suffered from fever and chills, from the agony of the swollen buboes, from diarrhea and vomiting. The conditions in plague houses were horrific. The treatments plague doctors could offer were limited and largely ineffective. They might lance the buboes, draining the pus and blood in the hope that releasing the bad humors would help. They might apply various poultices to the swellings. They might bleed the patient, that universal medieval remedy. They might prescribe herbal drinks or special foods. None of this worked against Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused the plague. Much of the plague doctor's actual function was administrative rather than therapeutic. They examined victims to confirm diagnoses of plague, necessary for official record-keeping and quarantine decisions. They counted the dead, keeping tallies that helped city officials track the outbreak's progress. They certified deaths, marking houses where plague had struck so others would know to avoid them. Some plague doctors also performed autopsies, cutting open the bodies of plague victims to try to understand the disease. This was dangerous work, exposing them to even greater risk of infection. What they found inside, the blackened, swollen lymph nodes, the darkened organs, the evidence of systemic destruction, must have been both fascinating and terrifying, clues to a puzzle they lacked the knowledge to solve. The plague doctors knew their costume didn't guarantee survival. Many plague doctors died despite their protective equipment. But the costume did seem to help. Physicians who wore the full protective gear had better survival rates than those who didn't. This wasn't because the aromatics filtered out miasma, that was superstition. It was because the leather costume created barriers between the physicians and the fleas that carried the actual disease. Famous plague doctors. While many plague doctors remain anonymous in historical records, some left behind enough documentation that we can reconstruct their lives and understand their experiences. These individuals provide windows into what it meant to be a plague doctor, to wear the costume, and to face the Black Death day after day. One of the most well-documented plague doctors was Nostradamus, better known today for his prophecies than for his medical work. Before he became famous for his cryptic predictions, Michel de Nostradame worked as a physician during plague outbreaks in southern France in the early 16th century. This was before the full bird beak costume had been developed, so Nostradamus worked with more rudimentary protection. Nostradamus advocated for sanitation measures that were ahead of his time. He insisted on removing corpses quickly, getting fresh air into sick rooms, and providing patients with clean water. He created a pill that contained rose hips, which we now know contain vitamin C and might have helped strengthen immune systems slightly. While he couldn't cure the plague, his emphasis on hygiene probably saved some lives by reducing secondary infections. Another notable plague doctor was George Thomson, who worked in London during the Great Plague of 1665. Thomson kept detailed records of his observations and treatments. He was skeptical of some traditional remedies and willing to experiment with new approaches. He documented the progression of symptoms in his patients, noting which treatments seemed to provide any relief, however minimal. Thomson wore the full protective costume, including the beaked mask, and he wrote about the experience. He described the claustrophobia of the enclosed leather mask, the difficulty of examining patients through the limited field of vision, the way the aromatics made his head ache after hours of wear. Yet he also credited the costume with saving his life, noting that many physicians who worked without full protection died while he survived. In Rome, a plague doctor named Giovanni Maria Lancisi worked during an outbreak in the early 18th century. Lancisi was unusual in that he questioned the miasma theory. He noticed that plague seemed to follow trade routes and spread from person to person in patterns that didn't quite match the behavior one would expect from poisonous air. While he didn't arrive at the correct explanation of flea-borne transmission, his observations and skepticism represented a step toward better understanding. These plague doctors and others like them were not monsters or villains, despite their frightening appearance. They were physicians trying to help in the face of a disease they couldn't cure, using the best knowledge available to them. They risked their lives regularly, and many lost those gambles. The costume they wore was an attempt to tilt the odds in their favor, to survive long enough to provide what little comfort and care they could. Variations in the costume. While Charles Delorme's design became the standard, plague doctors in different regions and time periods adapted the costume to local conditions, available materials, and personal preferences. These variations tell us about the spread of medical ideas across Europe and the ways practical experience shaped the costume's evolution. In Italy, some plague doctors wore masks with shorter beaks than the French design. The principle remained the same: aromatics packed inside to filter the air, but the Italian beaks were often more compact, perhaps easier to wear for long periods. Italian masks also sometimes featured more decorative elements, with elaborate tooling in the leather or ornamental details around the eye openings. Even in the face of death, Italian craftsmen brought their aesthetic sensibilities to bear. German plague doctors sometimes favored masks made from heavier, stiffer leather, reinforced to hold their shape even under difficult conditions. These masks were more durable but also more uncomfortable to wear. The trade-off between protection and comfort was constant, and different physicians made different choices about where to draw that line. In some regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, waxed cloth was used instead of leather for parts of the costume. This was partly a matter of availability and cost. Leather was expensive, but waxed cloth also had advantages. It was lighter, easier to move in, and could be treated with various substances believed to have protective properties. The downside was that it was less durable and might not provide as complete a barrier. The aromatics packed into the beak also varied by region and individual preference. Southern European doctors had access to Mediterranean herbs and spices that were expensive or unavailable in the north. Some physicians developed their own secret recipes, particular combinations they believed especially effective. These recipes might be passed down from master to student, modified based on experience, or sold to other physicians for substantial sums. Some plague doctors carried additional aromatics in small bags or pouches attached to their belts, refreshing the contents of their beaks throughout the day as the scents faded. Others carried vinegar-soaked sponges, holding them to the nostrils of their masks periodically, believing vinegar had purifying properties. Some used smoke, burning aromatic woods or resins and allowing the smoke to fill their masks before entering plague houses. The wooden canes also showed variation. Some were simple, unadorned staffs. Others were carved with medical symbols, religious imagery, or personal emblems. Some physicians had canes made with hollow sections where additional aromatics or medicinal substances could be stored. A few had canes with spring-loaded mechanisms that could be used to quickly measure a patient's pulse without extended contact. The boots varied as well. Some physicians wore standard riding boots, high and sturdy but not specially designed for medical work. Others had boots made specifically for plague work, with thick soles and higher shafts, treated with wax or oil like the rest of the costume. Some physicians wrapped their boots with additional cloth or leather strips before entering plague houses, creating extra barriers that could be removed and burned afterward. The psychological impact. The plague doctor's costume affected not just the physician who wore it but everyone who encountered it. The psychological dimensions of the costume, what it meant to wear it and what it meant to see it, were as important as its practical functions. For the physician, putting on the costume was a transformation. You ceased to be simply yourself and became the plague doctor, a role and an identity. The mask especially created distance between the person inside and the world outside. This psychological distancing might have been necessary, a way to cope with the horrors you would witness, the suffering you couldn't relieve, the deaths you couldn't prevent. Some physicians reported that the mask made it easier to do their work. Behind the bird-like face, they felt less vulnerable, more able to maintain professional detachment. The limited field of vision, while practically challenging, also meant you couldn't see everything at once. You had to focus on what was directly before you, one patient at a time, rather than being overwhelmed by the full scope of suffering in a plague house. The physical sensation of wearing the mask, the enclosed space, the filtered breathing, the echoing sound of your own respiration, created an almost meditative state. Some physicians described a kind of calm that settled over them once masked, a resignation or acceptance that allowed them to move through scenes of death without breaking down. For patients and their families, seeing the plague doctor arrive was a deeply ambivalent experience. On one hand, the doctor's presence meant someone was trying to help, that they hadn't been completely abandoned. On the other hand, the arrival of the plague doctor confirmed the worst. This was plague, the disease that killed more often than not, and the strange bird creature in your home was death's herald as much as its opponent. Children were often terrified by the masked doctors. They couldn't understand why this strange creature with the bird face had come into their home, couldn't process the adult explanations about doctors and medicine. To a child's eyes, the plague doctor was simply a monster, and their fear was not irrational. The mask was monstrous, deliberately inhuman, designed to create separation between doctor and disease but also creating separation between doctor and humanity. Some patients, delirious with fever, didn't recognize the masked figure as human. They might try to flee, might fight against examination or treatment, might cry out in terror. The plague doctor had to work quickly, using the wooden cane to maintain distance and control, speaking calmly through the mask to try to penetrate the patient's confusion and fear. For the general population, the sight of a plague doctor walking through the streets was an omen of death. People would press themselves against walls or duck into doorways to avoid getting close. Some made religious signs to ward off evil. Children would be pulled inside and doors hastily shut. The plague doctor walked through a bubble of isolation, avoided and feared even while being necessary. This fear and isolation must have taken a toll on the physicians themselves. To be shunned, to be seen as a harbinger of death rather than a healer, to be treated as something monstrous, this was part of the psychological burden the plague doctors carried along with their physical burdens. The daily life of a plague doctor. What was a typical day like for a plague doctor during an outbreak? The routine varied depending on the severity of the epidemic and the size of the city, but certain patterns emerged from the historical records and accounts that survive. A plague doctor might wake before dawn, spending time in prayer or meditation before beginning the day's work. Many plague doctors were religious men, and facing death daily made faith especially important. They would eat a substantial breakfast, knowing they might not have another chance to eat until evening. Then came the ritual of donning the costume. This wasn't something done quickly or carelessly. Each piece had to be properly fitted and secured. The aromatics in the beak had to be fresh or at least refreshed. The leather had to be checked for cracks or damage that might compromise its protective function. A servant or assistant might help with this process, though they too risked infection by proximity. Once costumed, the plague doctor would collect the wooden cane, perhaps a bag with medical implements and additional supplies, and set out into the city. The destinations were houses marked with red crosses or other symbols indicating plague had struck. These marks warned others to stay away but guided the plague doctor to where he was needed. Inside each house, the plague doctor would examine the sick, lance buboes if appropriate, prescribe what remedies existed, and offer what comfort could be given. Notes were taken about symptoms, progression of disease, and outcomes. These records served both medical and administrative purposes, helping to track the outbreak and providing data that might inform future responses. Between houses, the plague doctor might pause to refresh the aromatics in the mask, to drink water or wine, to simply breathe air that didn't smell of death and disease. These moments of respite were brief but necessary, physical and mental breaks in work that was both exhausting and traumatizing. As evening approached, the plague doctor would return home, but the day's work wasn't finished. The costume had to be carefully removed in a specific order to minimize contamination risk. Some physicians had elaborate procedures for this, removing each piece and having it immediately taken away for cleaning or disposal. The outer garments might be fumigated with smoke or washed in vinegar. The aromatics from the beak were disposed of and fresh materials prepared for the next day. Finally, the physician himself would wash thoroughly, change into clean clothes, and only then could he rest, eat a proper meal, or interact with family if he had any. Some plague doctors lived in isolation during outbreaks, separated from their families to protect them from possible infection. This isolation made the work even lonelier, even more psychologically demanding. The Great Plague of London. In the spring of 1665, plague returned to London with a vengeance. It would become known as the Great Plague, the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England and one of the most thoroughly documented plague epidemics in history. The plague doctors of London, wearing their bird-like masks, became central figures in the city's desperate struggle against the disease. The outbreak began in the poorest neighborhoods, in the overcrowded parishes outside the city walls where sanitation was poor and rats were abundant. At first, the deaths were scattered, easily overlooked or attributed to other causes. But by summer, the pattern was unmistakable. Plague had returned, and it was spreading quickly. London's response involved multiple levels of intervention. Houses where plague appeared were marked with red crosses painted on the doors, along with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." The entire household would be quarantined inside for 40 days, whether they were sick or not. Watchmen were posted outside to ensure no one left. Food and necessities were passed through windows or left at the door. This quarantine system was brutal in its logic. Healthy family members were locked inside with sick and dying relatives, almost guaranteeing they would become infected. But the alternative, allowing potentially infected people to move freely through the city, would spread the disease even faster. It was a choice between certain death for some and possible death for many more. The plague doctors moved through this landscape of locked houses and painted crosses, entering where others could not or would not go. They wore their full protective costumes, the leather beaks filled with aromatics, the long dark robes trailing behind them as they walked from house to house. Londoners knew what the costume meant. When they saw the bird-faced figures in the streets, they knew death was near. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, recorded his observations of plague doctors during this period. He described seeing them walking through streets that were otherwise nearly empty, the city having been largely abandoned by those wealthy enough to flee. He noted the fear the doctors inspired, even as people recognized they were necessary. He recorded the steady tolling of church bells marking funeral after funeral, and the plague doctors moving like dark shadows through the summer heat. The plague doctors examined victims, certified deaths, and kept the official tallies that tracked the outbreak's progress. The weekly bills of mortality, published throughout the epidemic, showed numbers climbing through the summer. At the peak, in September 1665, more than 7,000 people were dying each week in London alone. The true number was certainly higher, as many deaths went unreported. The Great Plague killed an estimated 100,000 people in London, roughly a quarter of the city's population. It devastated neighborhoods, emptied streets, and left trauma that would echo for generations. The plague doctors worked throughout, their bird-like masks becoming indelibly associated with one of London's darkest periods. The end of plague in Western Europe. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was followed by major outbreaks in other parts of Europe through the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The Great Plague of Vienna came in 1679, killing tens of thousands. The Great Plague of Marseille struck in 1720, devastating southern France. But after that, something remarkable happened. Plague essentially disappeared from Western Europe. The last major outbreak in Western Europe was that Marseille epidemic of 1720. After that, while plague continued to circulate in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia and the Middle East, it no longer returned to the European cities where it had been a recurring nightmare for centuries. The plague doctors could finally retire their bird-faced masks. Why did plague disappear from Western Europe? The answer is complex and involves multiple factors that came together in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. No single explanation is sufficient, but several important changes occurred during this period. One factor was the gradual replacement of the black rat, Rattus rattus, with the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, in Europe. The black rat was the primary host for the fleas that carried plague. It lived in close proximity to humans, nesting in thatched roofs and the walls of buildings. The brown rat, while still a pest, was less likely to live in such close contact with humans. This shift in rat populations, which happened over decades, reduced the opportunities for plague-carrying fleas to move from rats to humans. Improvements in housing construction also played a role. As wooden buildings were gradually replaced with brick and stone, as thatched roofs gave way to tile and slate, there were fewer places for rats to nest inside human dwellings. The separation between rat populations and human populations increased, even if only slightly. This created a buffer that made plague transmission less likely. Public health measures had also improved. Quarantine procedures, while often harsh and not fully effective, did help limit the spread of disease. Port cities developed better systems for inspecting ships and isolating cargo from regions where plague was known to exist. These measures couldn't prevent plague entirely, but they could slow its entry into new areas and reduce the scale of outbreaks when they did occur. Changes in trade patterns may have mattered as well. The routes by which plague had historically entered Europe from Asia shifted or became less heavily trafficked. New trade routes developed that bypassed some of the regions where plague remained endemic. While goods still flowed between continents, the specific pathways that had historically brought plague to European ports changed. Climate changes during what's known as the Little Ice Age might also have played a role. Cooler temperatures could have affected rat populations, flea reproduction rates, and the bacterium's ability to survive in certain environments. The relationship between climate and plague is complex and still debated by historians and scientists, but it may have been one factor among many. It's important to note that plague didn't disappear from the world, only from Western Europe. Major outbreaks continued to occur in Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Plague reached China in the late 19th century, causing massive epidemics. It spread to India in the 1890s, killing millions. It even reached San Francisco in 1900, causing a small but significant outbreak. But in Western Europe, the age of plague had ended. The bird-beaked plague doctors were no longer needed. The costume that had been a practical necessity for 2 centuries was now only a memory, a historical curiosity, an image from a darker time. Medical understanding advances. The disappearance of plague from Western Europe meant that European physicians had less direct experience with the disease. This was obviously a good thing for public health, but it also meant that the study of plague became more theoretical, based on historical records rather than ongoing observation. The plague doctor's costume became an artifact, something studied in medical museums rather than used in practice. Meanwhile, medicine itself was evolving rapidly. The 18th and 19th centuries saw fundamental advances in understanding how diseases worked and how they spread. The miasma theory that had dominated medical thinking for centuries was gradually being challenged and eventually replaced. The development of germ theory was crucial. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch demonstrated that diseases were caused not by bad air but by microscopic organisms, bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens. This was a revolutionary shift in understanding. If diseases were caused by specific organisms, then preventing disease meant preventing contact with those organisms. The mechanisms of transmission became crucial. In 1894, during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, a French physician named Alexander Yersin isolated the bacterium that caused plague. The organism was later named Yersinia pestis in his honor. This discovery was momentous. For the first time, the actual cause of plague had been identified. It wasn't miasma. It wasn't an imbalance of humors. It was a specific bacterium that could be studied, understood, and potentially controlled. Shortly after, researchers established that the bacterium was transmitted by fleas, and that rats were the primary host. The entire chain of transmission became clear. Infected fleas bit rats, the rats became infected, more fleas fed on the infected rats and picked up the bacteria, and when those fleas bit humans, the infection passed to people. This explained why plague outbreaks often began in port cities where ships brought infected rats, why it spread through crowded urban areas where rats were abundant, and why it seemed to follow trade routes. This new understanding transformed public health responses to plague. Instead of fumigating houses with aromatic smoke or marking doors with crosses, effective plague control meant controlling rat populations and preventing flea bites. Modern outbreaks were managed with insecticides to kill fleas, rat control programs, quarantine of infected individuals, and eventually with antibiotics once those became available. Looking back at the plague doctor's costume with modern medical knowledge, we can see it was both more and less effective than its creators believed. The aromatics in the beak did nothing to prevent plague, miasma theory was wrong. But the heavy leather costume, the gloves, the full coverage of skin, these did provide some protection, not because they kept out bad air, but because they created a physical barrier between the physician and the fleas that carried the disease. A plague doctor in full costume was less likely to be bitten by infected fleas than someone in ordinary clothing. The thick, waxed leather was difficult for fleas to penetrate. The gloves protected the hands, where flea bites often occurred. The boots protected the feet and lower legs. Without knowing it, without understanding the actual mechanism of disease transmission, the plague doctors had created a costume that offered genuine protection, just not for the reasons they thought. This accidental effectiveness reveals something important about medical history. Practices can work even when the theories behind them are wrong. Empirical observation, noticing that doctors who wore the costume survived at higher rates, led to the costume's adoption, even though the explanation for why it worked was incorrect. This pattern appears repeatedly in medical history: right practice, wrong theory. The costume becomes mythology. As plague faded from Western European experience and medicine advanced beyond miasma theory, the plague doctor's costume took on new cultural meanings. It was no longer a practical tool but had become a symbol, an image freighted with associations of death, disease, and the medieval past. In the 19th century, as the Romantic movement swept through European art and literature, there was renewed interest in the medieval period and its imagery. Artists and writers looked back to the Middle Ages and Renaissance as times of mystery, darkness, and drama. The plague doctor, with that distinctive bird-faced mask, was a perfect embodiment of this romanticized dark past. Paintings and illustrations depicting plague doctors began to appear, not as medical documentation but as historical drama. Artists imagined scenes of masked doctors moving through medieval streets, attending to dying patients, standing over corpses. These images were often more fantastical than accurate, emphasizing the strange and frightening aspects of the costume while taking liberties with historical details. The mask especially captured imaginations. That long, curved beak, the dark glass eyes, the leather that gave the whole thing an organic, unsettling quality, it was unlike anything else in medical history. It looked more like a creature than a piece of equipment, something that might exist in nightmares or dark fairy tales. Writers incorporated plague doctors into Gothic fiction and horror stories. The masked figure became a stock character, representing death's inevitability, the terror of disease, or sometimes darker themes about the price of knowledge and the corruption of healing. In these stories, the plague doctor was often portrayed as sinister or even malevolent, far from the brave or desperate physicians who had actually worn the costume. This transformation from practical equipment to cultural symbol was complete by the early 20th century. Few people had any direct memory of actual plague doctors or plague outbreaks in Europe. The costume existed primarily in historical records, museum collections, and the popular imagination. It had become mythology, a piece of the past that carried powerful symbolic weight even as its practical context faded from living memory. The mask in early cinema and theater. As the 20th century dawned and new forms of entertainment emerged, the plague doctor's mask found new life in theater and early cinema. directors and producers discovered that the distinctive silhouette and unsettling appearance of the bird-faced doctor translated powerfully to visual media. In European theater, particularly in Germany and France, plague doctor costumes began appearing in productions that dealt with historical themes or explored death and disease symbolically. Expressionist theater, with its emphasis on distorted reality and psychological horror, found the plague doctor mask especially useful. The exaggerated features, the elongated beak, the blank eye openings, fit perfectly with the expressionist aesthetic. Early horror films occasionally featured plague doctor imagery, though these appearances were often brief or background elements. The silent film era relied heavily on visual impact, and the plague doctor's distinctive silhouette could convey menace and dread without need for dialogue or explanation. A figure in a bird-like mask walking through fog-shrouded streets was immediately unsettling, even to audiences who might not know the historical context. The mask also appeared in masquerade balls and costume parties among the wealthy, particularly in Italy, where Venice's carnival tradition incorporated plague doctor masks into its elaborate celebrations. These carnival masks were often more decorative than historically accurate, embellished with gold leaf, jewels, and ribbons. The transformation from protective equipment to party costume represented another stage in the mask's evolution from practical object to cultural symbol. In theater productions dealing with the Black Death or medieval settings, costume designers had to decide how faithful to be to historical accuracy versus dramatic impact. Some created elaborate, theatrical versions of the costume that emphasized its strange and frightening qualities. Others attempted more historically accurate recreations based on museum examples and historical illustrations. Both approaches recognized the mask's powerful visual impact. The plague doctor also appeared in political cartoons and satirical artwork during this period, sometimes representing death itself, other times symbolizing quarantine, isolation, or medical authority. During the influenza pandemic of 1918, some cartoonists drew on plague doctor imagery to represent the threat of disease, even though the actual plague doctors had been gone for 2 centuries. The mask had become a universal symbol for epidemic disease. Children's illustrations sometimes featured plague doctors in fairy tales or cautionary stories, usually as frightening figures representing danger or death. These appearances, while often taking liberties with historical accuracy, helped keep the image alive in popular culture. Each generation encountered the plague doctor mask in new contexts, ensuring it remained recognizable and culturally relevant. The mask in literature. Writers in the 20th century found the plague doctor a rich source of imagery and symbolism. The mask appeared in various literary genres, from historical fiction to horror to philosophical works, each using it to explore different themes and ideas. Historical novels set during plague times naturally featured plague doctors as characters. These portrayals varied widely in their historical accuracy and their treatment of the doctors themselves. Some authors presented them as heroes, brave physicians fighting impossible odds. Others portrayed them as opportunists, profiting from tragedy. Still others used them as neutral observers, chroniclers moving through scenes of suffering. In horror literature, the plague doctor became an increasingly popular figure, especially in works that drew on historical settings or Gothic traditions. The mask's inhuman appearance made it perfect for creating atmosphere and dread. Authors could describe the slow approach of the bird-faced figure, the click of its wooden cane on cobblestones, the wheeze of breath through the aromatic-filled beak, building tension through sensory details. Some horror writers transformed the plague doctor into something supernatural or demonic, a figure that brought death rather than fighting it. In these stories, the costume became almost a body horror element, with suggestions that the mask might be fused to the wearer's face or that something other than a human physician lurked beneath the leather. These interpretations moved far from historical reality but revealed what made the image so persistently unsettling. Philosophical and allegorical works used the plague doctor to explore themes of mortality, medical ethics, and the relationship between healer and patient. The mask's function as a barrier, protecting the doctor but also creating distance from those being treated, became a metaphor for various types of emotional or professional distance. Writers explored what it meant to try to heal while maintaining absolute separation, to care for someone while hidden behind an inhuman face. Poetry occasionally employed plague doctor imagery, usually emphasizing the mask's symbolic resonance rather than historical accuracy. The bird-like appearance suggested various metaphors: death as a carrion bird, the physician as neither fully human nor fully animal, the costume as a chrysalis or shell that transformed the person inside. Poets found in the plague doctor a figure that existed between categories, neither quite alive nor dead, neither fully human nor entirely other. Science fiction and alternate history writers sometimes incorporated plague doctors into their works, imagining worlds where plague never ended and the costume remained necessary, or futures where new diseases required similar protective measures. These speculative uses of the image connected historical plague to contemporary fears about pandemics and bioterrorism. Young adult and children's literature occasionally featured plague doctors, though usually in sanitized or less frightening forms. These appearances introduced younger readers to the historical reality of plague while often using the costume as a mystery or adventure element rather than pure horror. A protagonist might discover an old plague doctor mask in an attic, setting off a story about uncovering family history or solving a historical puzzle. Museums and historical preservation. As interest in medical history grew throughout the 20th century, museums began actively collecting and preserving plague doctor costumes and related artifacts. These efforts ensured that physical examples of the costume survived and could be studied by future generations. Several European medical museums acquired plague doctor costumes, though authenticating these pieces proved challenging. Many supposed plague doctor masks turned out to be later recreations or carnival masks rather than actual medical equipment from the 17th or 18th centuries. The leather and fabric used in the original costumes didn't preserve well over centuries, and few complete original costumes survived intact. The German Medical History Museum in Ingolstadt houses one of the better documented collections of plague-related artifacts, including what are believed to be authentic elements of plague doctor costumes. The Wellcome Collection in London also preserves plague-related materials as part of its extensive medical history holdings. These institutions have made their collections available for scholarly research and public education. Museum exhibits about plague and plague doctors have proven consistently popular with visitors. The combination of historical significance, medical interest, and the sheer visual impact of the costume draws crowds. Exhibits typically include explanations of miasma theory, details about how plague actually spread, and context about the historical plague outbreaks that necessitated such extreme protective measures. Some museums have commissioned accurate recreations of plague doctor costumes for display purposes, working with historians and craftspeople to reproduce the costume as faithfully as possible based on historical descriptions and surviving examples. These recreations help visitors understand what the costume actually looked like and how it functioned, beyond the stylized versions that appear in popular culture. Interactive exhibits have allowed visitors to experience aspects of the costume, such as looking through replica eye openings to see how limited the doctor's vision would have been, or smelling some of the aromatics that would have been packed into the beak. These hands-on elements help people understand the practical challenges and sensory experience of wearing the costume. Living history demonstrations and historical reenactments occasionally feature plague doctors, with performers wearing recreated costumes and explaining the historical context. These demonstrations can be powerful educational tools, making the past tangible and immediate in ways that static displays cannot. However, they also risk sensationalizing or trivializing the genuine suffering and fear that plague caused. Conservation of existing artifacts presents ongoing challenges. The leather, fabric, and organic materials used in plague doctor costumes deteriorate over time. Museums must balance the desire to display these items with the need to preserve them, carefully controlling light, temperature, and humidity to slow decay. Some fragile pieces can only be displayed briefly or not at all, existing primarily in climate-controlled storage and accessible only to serious researchers. Digital preservation has become increasingly important. Museums have created detailed photographic and 3D scanned records of plague doctor artifacts, ensuring that even if the physical objects eventually deteriorate beyond repair, accurate records of their appearance and construction will survive. These digital archives are often made available online, allowing researchers and interested individuals worldwide to study the costumes without needing to handle fragile originals. The mask in modern horror. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw an explosion of plague doctor imagery in horror media. Films, television shows, video games, and other forms of entertainment discovered or rediscovered the mask's power to disturb and frighten. Horror films began using plague doctor masks with increasing frequency, recognizing that the image carried instant atmosphere and dread. A figure in a plague doctor mask could appear in the background of a scene, standing motionless, and immediately signal that something was wrong. The mask's inhuman quality, the way it obscured the face while creating its own unsettling visage, made it perfect for horror. Some films used the plague doctor mask for slasher villains or serial killers, criminals who adopted the costume for its frightening appearance and symbolic associations with death. In these stories, the historical context was often minimal or absent. The mask was chosen purely for its visual impact and the fear it inspired. This use divorced the mask from its actual history, transforming it into a generic symbol of menace. Other horror media engaged more thoughtfully with the mask's historical origins, creating stories set during actual plague times or using the costume in ways that acknowledged its medical purpose. These works explored the horror inherent in the historical reality, the mass death, the desperate measures, the futility of treatments, the isolation and fear that plague brought. The costume became not just a scary prop but a window into genuine historical horror. Video games discovered the plague doctor mask and costume as powerful visual elements. Games set in dark fantasy worlds, historical settings, or post-apocalyptic futures incorporated plague doctor imagery, often with creative variations on the traditional design. The mask appeared on healers, on enemies, on mysterious NPCs whose motives were unclear. Its association with both healing and death made it narratively flexible, suitable for various roles within game stories. The SCP Foundation, a collaborative online fiction project, featured several entries involving plague doctors, including SCP-049, probably the most famous fictional plague doctor in internet culture. This entity, portrayed as both doctor and monster, combined historical plague doctor elements with body horror and dark fantasy. The popularity of this character introduced the plague doctor image to millions who might never have encountered it through historical channels.